Isaac Newton gave us gravity, calculus, and the laws that still guide rockets into space. He is the founder of modern science. But for nearly 30 years, inside a private laboratory at Cambridge, the same man kept his furnaces burning almost around the clock, chasing a very different goal. He was trying to turn ordinary metal into gold. He filled close to 1 million words of notes with alchemy, written in cramped, secret handwriting. And that obsession was only his second biggest secret. The first one could have destroyed his career and cost him his freedom. To the world, Isaac Newton was untouchable. By his 40s, he was a professor at Trinity College, Cambridge, the author of the Principia, the book that explained the motion of the planets and the fall of an apple with the same clean set of equations. Later, he would run the Royal Mint in London, get knighted by a queen, and lead the Royal Society. When he died, England gave him a state funeral and buried him in Westminster Abbey, among kings. The poet Alexander Pope wrote that nature lay hidden in the dark until God said, "Let Newton be," and there was light. That is the Newton that you and I always found in the textbooks. Calm, rational, the first great mind of the age of reason. But there was another Newton that I think you didn't ever see mentioned, or at least not in the mainstream sources, and he lived in the shadows, behind a locked door, next to a fire that almost never went out. Because when Newton died in 1727, the men sorting through his belongings found something they did not expect. Not equations, not star charts. They found a mountain of handwritten papers, filled with strange symbols, coded recipes, and the names of long-dead alchemists. There were so many that his own family did not know what to do with them. In the end, they were labeled with 3 simple words: not fit to be printed. And for almost 200 years, that is exactly where they stayed. Hidden. So what was inside them? Let's start with the fire. Around 1669, in his rooms at Trinity College, Newton began ordering unusual equipment: furnaces, glass flasks, crucibles for melting metal, chemicals with names most people had never heard. He built himself a private laboratory in a small garden beside the college chapel, and he sealed himself inside it for weeks at a time. His assistant during these years was a young man named Humphrey Newton, no relation, who worked as his secretary, and the picture he later described is unforgettable. Isaac would work through the night, bent over his glowing furnaces, so absorbed that he forgot to eat and forgot to sleep. The fires, Humphrey said, were rarely allowed to go out. Newton tended them in shifts, watching the colors shift in the flames and the strange substances bubbling inside the glass. This was not a hobby. Over roughly 30 years, Newton wrote and copied close to 1 million words on the subject. Scholars have counted at least 130 separate manuscripts in his hand. He even built a giant index of alchemical knowledge, cross-referencing more than 100 different authors, a private encyclopedia of a forbidden art. The founder of modern physics was also one of the most dedicated alchemists in England, and the way he wrote about it should give you chills. Newton did not write in plain language. He wrote in the secret code of the alchemists, a world of dragons and serpents and hidden fire. He wrote about the green lion, about the 2 serpents, about something called Sophic mercury, a mysterious substance the alchemists believed was the first ingredient of the ultimate prize. He even signed some of these papers with a hidden name: Jehovah Sanctus Unus, Latin for Jehovah, the one holy God. And it was not chosen at random. It was an anagram, built from the letters of the Latin spelling of his own name, Isaacus Newtonus. Newton had literally hidden himself inside the name of God. So what was he chasing behind that locked door? The alchemists called it the Great Work. The goal was a legendary substance known as the Philosopher's Stone, and the powers attached to it sound like pure fantasy today. It was said to transform base metals like lead into pure gold. Some believed it could cure any disease and even stretch the length of a human life. To us, that sounds like a fairy tale. But here is the part that is genuinely hard to accept. In Newton's century, this was not fringe thinking. In the 1600s, alchemy and chemistry were the same field. There was no clear line between them. Robert Boyle, the man often called the father of modern chemistry, was himself a committed alchemist. Some of the sharpest minds in Europe believed that metals grew slowly inside the earth, the way plants grow up out of soil, and that a skilled experimenter could speed that ripening up inside a flask. Newton took this seriously. In his notebooks, he treated the earth almost like a living body, with metals maturing in its veins. He was not a crank chasing a delusion. He was a brilliant, careful experimenter, applying the exact same tools he used on light and gravity to a problem that, in his time, looked completely reasonable. He weighed, he measured, he recorded temperatures and colors and timings with obsessive precision. He was trying to reverse engineer the source code of matter itself, and he was frightened by what he might find. In 1676, Newton wrote a letter to Henry Oldenburg, the Secretary of the Royal Society, about Boyle. Boyle had just published hints about that same Sophic mercury, and Newton was alarmed. He urged that Boyle be held to, in his own words, high silence. Newton believed some knowledge was simply too dangerous to release, that certain secrets could do enormous damage if they got out. Sit with that for a moment. The most rational man of his era believed he was standing at the edge of something that had to be kept buried. But as strange as the alchemy was, it was not the secret that could have ended him. Because while Newton was decoding the universe of matter, he was quietly decoding something far more dangerous. The Bible itself. Isaac Newton was raised in the Church of England, and to everyone around him, he looked like a faithful member of it. But in private, through years of intense study of the oldest Christian writings, Newton reached a conclusion that in his time was not merely controversial, it was criminal. Newton decided that the central doctrine of Christianity, the Trinity, the belief that God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are three equal persons in one, was false. Not an honest mistake. A deliberate corruption slipped into the faith by church leaders back in the 4th century. He came to believe that God the Father alone was the one true God, and that worshiping Jesus as God was a form of idolatry, a breaking of the very first commandment. To understand how dangerous this belief was, picture the England he lived in. Denying the Trinity was treated as barely a step above atheism. Just 3 decades before Newton was born, 2 men in England had been burned alive at the stake for exactly these views. This was not an abstract risk on a page. If Newton had spoken openly, he could have lost everything. His position, his reputation, his liberty. So he did something that took real nerve. He hid it, in plain sight. And here is where the story becomes almost too perfect. Newton was a fellow of Trinity College, a college named for the exact doctrine he had secretly decided was a fraud. Worse, the rules demanded that by 1675 he become an ordained priest in the Church of England and swear loyalty to that doctrine out loud. Newton could not do it. But he could not confess why, either. So he quietly fought for an escape, and in 1675, with the help of his old mentor Isaac Barrow, he won a special dispensation signed off by King Charles II, releasing him from the requirement to take holy orders. He kept his chair, kept his silence, and kept his secret. One historian later described this kind of concealed faith with an old term, a Nicodemite, someone who hides their true beliefs to stay safe. And Newton had a live example of the alternative. A scholar of his own time named William Whiston said similar things about the Trinity openly, and was thrown out of Cambridge for it. Newton watched it happen and said nothing. If you're finding this as strange and gripping as I am, take a second to subscribe. This channel digs into the hidden history that textbooks quietly skip every single week. Now, Newton did not reject the Trinity on a hunch. He went after it like a detective. He zeroed in on a single line in the Bible that seemed to prove the doctrine, a verse in the first letter of John. Then he tracked down the oldest Greek manuscripts he could find, and he showed that the key phrase simply was not there in the earliest copies. It had been added in later, by human hands. And here is the remarkable part. Modern scholars now agree with him. That verse is treated as a later insertion today, and it has been removed or footnoted in most serious modern Bibles. Newton reached the right answer 3 centuries early, working in total secrecy. And then there is the prophecy. Because Newton was convinced the Bible was far more than a book of faith, he believed it was a cryptogram, a coded message left by God, hiding the entire timeline of human history for anyone clever enough to crack it. And Newton fully intended to be that person. He spent decades on the Book of Daniel and the Book of Revelation, treating their visions of beasts and trumpets like a mathematical puzzle to be solved. He built a system. A prophetic day, he decided, stood for a year, and using that key, in a manuscript written in 1704, he ran the calculation that has unsettled people ever since. Starting from the year 800, the crowning of the first Holy Roman Emperor, he counted forward a symbolic 1,260 years. The answer landed on one date, the year 2060. Now, before you panic, listen to what he actually meant. Newton was not predicting fire raining from the sky. He believed 2060 would be a reset, the end of a corrupt age, and the start of a new one, a kingdom of peace on earth. And I think that right here is the twist almost nobody mentions. Newton did not do this math because he wanted to terrify people. He did the exact opposite. He was disgusted by preachers who kept naming doomsday dates and dragging religion into ridicule every time their predictions failed. He worked out 2060, in his own words, to put a stop to the rash conjectures of fanciful men. He deliberately chose a date far in the future, so that no living person could use it to whip a crowd into fear. The greatest scientist in history did the math on the apocalypse in order to calm everyone down. That single manuscript sat unseen for centuries. Today, part of it is kept in a university library in Jerusalem, and when it was finally put on display and featured in a BBC documentary, it made headlines around the world. But secrets like these come at a price, and Newton may have paid it with his own mind. Remember those years hunting the philosopher's stone, leaning over the fumes of his furnaces, handling mercury with his bare hands. Mercury is a poison. It attacks the brain. And in 1693, Newton suffered a frightening collapse. He stopped sleeping. He wrote strange, paranoid letters to friends like the philosopher John Locke, accusing them of plotting against him, then writing back days later in confusion and apology. Much later, when surviving samples of Newton's hair were analyzed, they were found to hold levels of mercury far above normal, along with other toxic metals. Historians still argue over how much the poison damaged him, but the image is hard to shake. The finest mind of its age, slowly clouded by the very experiments it could not stop performing. Newton died in 1727, and his mountain of secret papers, the alchemy, the heresy, the prophecy, was boxed up and passed down through the family, judged too scandalous to print. For nearly 200 years, the world had no idea. Then, in 1936, the collection finally came up for sale at an auction house in London. Cambridge had never wanted it. The papers were dismissed as non-scientific clutter, sold off cheaply, and scattered among different buyers. But one man understood what he was holding. His name was John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist of the 20th century. Keynes began buying back the alchemical papers and slowly reassembling the collection. And the more he read, the more the familiar image of Newton fell apart in his hands. This was not the cold, pure rationalist of the schoolbooks. This was a man who saw the entire universe as a riddle set by God, a secret buried in the stars, in the elements, and in ancient scripture, waiting for one chosen mind to solve it. In a famous lecture, Keynes delivered the verdict that gives this whole story its name. Newton, he said, was not the first scientist of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians. And that is the thing we get wrong about Isaac Newton. We imagine there were two of him, the genius who mapped the heavens, and the strange mystic burning Mercury in the dark. But to Newton, there was never a divide. The gravity, the alchemy, the prophecy. It was all one investigation, one search for the single hidden order behind everything. He was not doing science by day and magic in secret. He was hunting for the fingerprints of God with every tool he could get his hands on. Today, scholars at Oxford and in the United States are finally transcribing all of it, millions of words, and publishing the papers Newton hid for a lifetime. The man who taught the world to think like a scientist spent his own life convinced that the deepest truths were written in code, and that magic and science were just two doors into the same locked room. So maybe I think that the real question isn't why a genius like Newton believed in magic. Maybe it's this. What did he think he was so close to finding that he guarded it in secret for the rest of his life?